Welcome to the Wonder Fungi Podcast.
Today, we are diving into, one of the great paradoxes at the intersection of psychology, neuroscience, and, frankly, spirituality. And that is the attempt to measure something that is almost by definition immeasurable. We're talking about the transcendent, the spiritual, the mystical experience.
And doing it with a checklist.
Doing it with a simple 30-item checklist.
That really is the core tension here, isn't it? It's how can we as, modern data-driven people who believe in empirical evidence,
Right.
how can we possibly quantify something so internal, so subjective, an experience where people report meeting the divine or feeling completely at one with the entire cosmos?
Yeah, or experiencing just pure being.
Exactly. And we're taking that vastness, and we're trying to reduce it down to a multiple choice survey score. It sounds absurd on the surface.
It does. I mean, you're talking about experiences that have been described for millennia across every culture and religion.
Yeah.
They're always described as these profound, life-changing encounters with a reality that feels, more real than real. And they have these distinct qualities, like a sense of sacredness or what they call a noetic quality.
What does that mean exactly?
Noetic quality.
It's that feeling of direct knowledge, the sense that what you're experiencing isn't just a dream or a hallucination, but an objective truth you've just been given access to.
Okay, got it. So that plus this feeling of oneness, it just seems like the complete antithesis of a standardized 30-question survey.
Completely.
So, okay, let's give the listener some background here, because this tool, this measurement, it didn't just appear out of nowhere.
No, not at all.
This whole framework really comes from the work of a philosopher, Walter Stace, way back in 1960. He did this massive study.
Right, a comparative study.
Yeah, he looked at mystical accounts from saints, yogis, poets, even just ordinary people, and he came to this conclusion that despite all the cultural window dressing, there was a consistent, shared common core to all of them. And that was a revolutionary idea. Stace's definitions really became the intellectual bedrock for the scientific study of mysticism. His work allowed us to move past just dismissing these experiences as, religious delusion or something.
Right.
It allowed us to start treating them as a genuine, definable phenomenon of consciousness. And that definition, that was the basis for the very first mystical experience questionnaire, the MEQ-43.
That was the original.
That was the original, developed by Ponke and Richards back in the 60s for those landmark studies, like the Good Friday experiment.
And now, fast forward through decades of refinement, and we have the MEQ-30. This is considered the gold standard, the absolute state-of-the-art measure for acute psychedelic effects in clinical research.
Especially in those big, high-stakes psilocybin studies coming out of places like Johns Hopkins and NYU.
Yeah.
It's the language that science has developed to talk about the sublime.
And that's really the mission of our deep dive today. We're not just going to talk about the philosophy of this checklist. We are going to investigate the really startling research that shows the scores on this seemingly simple survey are significantly correlated with massive, lasting, positive changes in people's lives. We're talking about predicting whether someone can quit a lifelong debilitating addiction
Based on how they score on a measurement of spiritual feeling.
The sheer audacity of that claim is what makes this so compelling. We are literally trying to uncover the empirical mechanism. How does measuring the subjective intensity of a feeling of God,
Or unity, or oneness.
how does that lead directly to a therapeutic outcome that just defies what standard medicine expects? We have to understand what this thing is actually capturing.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's unpack this thing. If scientists are really trying to quantify a mystical state, what are the core components they decided were absolutely essential to track? They can't just put a question like, did you see the meaning of life, yes or no, on a survey?
No, absolutely not. The development of the MEQ-30 was a really long, rigorous process. It involved a ton of psychometric validation, mostly using a statistical method called factor analysis.
Right.
This was led by researchers like McLean and his colleagues back in 2012. They took the original 43 items and used these statistical tools to whittle them down to the 30 we use now.
So it's not just arbitrary. They statistically proved that these 30 questions are the ones that most reliably capture the experience, specifically the one people have on psilocybin.
Exactly. It's a process of statistical pruning to make sure the final questions are robust.
And crucially, the participants, they rate these items on a 6-point scale, right? It's not just a yes or no.
That's a key point. It's a scale of intensity. They're asked to grade the magnitude of the experience. It goes from 0, which is none, not at all the way up to 5.
And what's 5?
5 is defined as extreme, more than ever before in my life. So that range really shows you that the researchers are deeply interested in the peak intensity of the subjective feeling. And that factor analysis, it revealed a really solid, reliable four-factor structure for these experiences. And what's amazing is how well they line up with Walter Stace's original philosophical ideas from 1960.
Okay, walk us through them. What are the four factors? Let's start with the biggest one.
Okay, so first and most important is mysticality. This is the core factor. It's actually a compound factor that combines a few different elements.
Like what?
It includes the experience of unity, that noetic quality we mentioned, the sense of ultimate truth, and also sacredness, that feeling that the experience is holy or divine.
So it's really capturing that core feeling of oneness with everything, that sense of transcendence and objective reality.
Precisely. That's mysticality.
Okay. So if mysticality is about oneness and truth, what about just raw, positive emotion? Where does that fit in?
That brings us to the second factor, positive mood. Now, this might sound like just, feeling happy.
Right.
But it's measuring something much more profound. It's tracking these intense feelings of peace, joy, awe, and ecstasy that go way beyond everyday contentment. People describe it as a feeling of complete and total bliss or perfect love.
Right.
It's overwhelming in its magnitude.
Wow. Okay, so we have mysticality and positive mood. What's number 3?
Number 3 is transcendence of time and space. This is a classic hallmark of these states.
I've heard about this, the sense that time stops.
Exactly. It covers the loss of the usual sense of clock time, a feeling of existing in eternity or infinity, and also that sense of losing awareness of where your body ends and the world begins. The physical, mundane world it dissolves.
And the last one, you said it was the most philosophical?
And the most contradictory, in a way.
Mm-hmm.
The fourth factor is ineffability.
Ineffability.
Which is the sense that the experience cannot be adequately described in words. The feeling that it's fundamentally incomprehensible or inexpressible.
So you're measuring your inability to measure it.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating paradox right there in the structure of the test.
Okay, I want to dive a little deeper into that first factor, mysticality, because you said it contains this element that seems to be really central to the whole therapeutic process.
Yes.
Unity and ego dissolution.
That's the one. Unity is where we find both the internal and external pieces of oneness. And historically, Stace, when he was first building this framework, he actually distinguished between the two.
How so?
He talked about introvertive mysticism, which was the experience of pure consciousness within yourself, stripped of all sensory input. And then extrovertive mysticism, which was seeing the unity through the world, perceiving oneness in the objects around you.
What I find so cool about this is how the modern research, the data, actually ended up validating these old philosophical ideas.
It's a huge win for the MEQ30's rigor. The factor analysis, which looked at tons and tons of data from controlled psilocybin studies, showed that these two historically separate ideas, internal unity and external unity, they actually load onto a single underlying factor.
So why does that matter? What does that tell us?
It suggests that, at least in a typical time-limited psilocybin session, the experience of losing your sense of self, that's internal unity or ego dissolution, and the experience of fusing with a greater whole that you perceive outwardly.
External unity.
Right, that they are fundamentally two sides of the same coin. It's a single, unitary psychological event. You lose your personal boundaries, and at the same moment, you perceive this profound interconnection with everything else.
So it's not just about losing your personal self, which frankly could sound terrifying on its own.
It can be.
But it's that the loss of self immediately leads to this feeling of profound, loving interconnectedness.
That's the key.
Let's use some of the descriptions from the source material to make this a little more real. This idea of unity. What are people actually saying?
They report this radical loss of self, and then it's immediately followed by identifying with something much larger. Internal unity is described as, quote, experience of oneness in relation to an inner world within, or a feeling of freedom from the limitations of the personal self, and a unity with what was felt to be greater than your personal self. The personal ego just steps aside for a while.
And the external side, you said, is more visual and visceral.
Very much so. You see descriptions like experience of oneness or unity with objects and or persons perceived in your surroundings. I remember one famous description of someone looking at the grain in a piece of wood and just feeling like they merged with it.
Yeah.
The source material captures it perfectly. It says, with eyes open, seeing something in your surroundings more and more intensely, and then feeling as though you and it become one.
That fusion, that loss of the bounded personal self, that feels like the mechanism, that's what creates the therapeutic window.
It is. The psychological consequence of that feeling is massive. This deep sense of unity is what seems to underlie all these pro-social changes we see later on. Greater empathy, less self-focus, increased closeness to others.
I read that one researcher noted that people who had this strong sense of unity would even, distribute money more equally between themselves and a stranger in a lab game.
Yeah, it demonstrates a measurable shift away from pure self-interest. It's really profound.
Okay, so that brings us to the most mind-bending factor of all. Ineffability.
Mm-hmm.
This is the one that seems to just fundamentally contradict the whole idea of a checklist. How on earth do you measure something that, by its very definition, cannot be expressed in words? Isn't that a paradox just built right into the method?
It absolutely is a philosophical contradiction. And it's something the research community really grapples with. The MEQ30 measures ineffability by asking participants to rate items about the difficulty of conceptualizing or describing the experience.
So if you score high on ineffability, you're basically formally agreeing with the statement that words fail.
Exactly. You're endorsing the idea that the phenomena is beyond language.
I always think of that classic analogy. It's like trying to explain the color blue to someone who's been blind their entire life.
That's a perfect analogy.
You can talk about wavelengths and light and emotion, but they lack the fundamental sensory experience. You don't have a shared experience, so you don't have a shared vocabulary.
And that is the absolute crux of the philosophical debate here. Many experts argue that effability, our ability to describe something easily, like a chair, is simply the product of shared experience and shared language.
Right. We all know what a chair is.
Exactly. But since these psychedelic states, these pivotal mental states, are so far outside our normal everyday consciousness, we just don't have the agreed upon words for them yet.
But the paradox is a little less intense because even though the experience seems indescribable, it does have a consistent content. People might say they can't explain it, but they still report these universal themes, right?
Precisely. And that's where something called quantitative linguistic analysis comes in. It's a brilliant way to study the ineffable. Researchers use natural language processing to analyze the actual words that people use in their reports after the session.
So they're comparing the vocabulary of people who scored high on the MEQ versus those who scored low.
Exactly.
So what language is coming out of this experience that people claim they can't describe?
The data is so revealing. The high MEQ scores, they use language that is heavily focused on social and spatial inclusion.
What does that mean?
They use words like everything, we, oneness, and with way more frequently. This quantitatively supports the idea that the core content, even if it's hard to articulate, is about losing boundaries and feeling interconnected. It's a move away from the isolated I.
That is a crucial insight. It confirms that the experience is fundamentally about interconnection.
And here's the other critical finding from that analysis. They found that these high scores used fewer overtly religious words.
Like what?
Fewer words like church, prayed, or the names of specific deities.
That's huge, because that immediately suggests that the mystical quality being measured here isn't tied to any specific religious belief or dogma.
It's not. It's a universal, metaphysical, or existential shift of perspective about the nature of reality itself. That profound insight that all is one is being communicated, even when the person says the whole thing is too vast to capture.
It confirms that the MEQ30 is measuring some kind of core human capacity for transcendence, not just adherence to a particular faith.
It's an insight that goes beyond specific religious frameworks. That's why you often hear people use non-religious but still spiritual terms like universal energy or cosmic intelligence in their reports.
Okay, so after you run through all 30 of these items and the participant rates their intensity across all 4 of these factors, how do the researchers draw the line? How do they determine if someone had a truly transformative experience versus just, a strong trip?
This is the crucial scientific benchmark. It's called the 60% rule, and it defines what's known as the complete mystical experience, or CME.
A CME.
Right. A CME is scored only when a participant hits 60% or higher of the maximum possible score across all 4 of the MEQ30 subscales.
All 4.
All 4. Mysticality, positive mood, transcendence of time and space, and ineffability.
So that requirement scoring high across all the categories, that's the sharp dividing line. It's not enough to just feel super happy or to see cool visuals.
Yeah.
You have to experience that whole package. The profound unity, the sacredness, the timelessness, and feel that it was deeply significant but hard to explain.
And that CME threshold, it's not arbitrary. It's been empirically validated as a valuable predictor of positive outcomes. It's like a statistical filter.
How so?
Well, for instance, in studies that looked at long-term personality change. It was only the participants who met the criteria for CME who showed those sustained improvements.
What about the others?
Those who had intense trips but scored below the 60% threshold across all 4 factors.
Yeah.
They just didn't demonstrate those lasting changes.
Okay, so now we know what they're measuring, this 4-part definition of a transcendent experience. But the real question, the fascinating one, is still, why? Why does this specific pattern of feeling unified and timeless and awestruck translate into lasting behavioral change? Why does measuring feeling like God help someone quit smoking?
The answer to that lies in the concept that sits right at the very heart of that mysticality factor.
Ego dissolution.
Ego dissolution. And the state of mind it creates, which researchers have now termed the pivotal mental state.
Okay, let's look closer at this temporary loss of self, this ego dissolution. What exactly is the self or ego that's being dismantled here?
The ego that dissolves is seen as this multidimensional construct. It includes, first, the narrative self-concept. That's the continuous internal monologue, the story you're always telling yourself about who you are, your memories, your past mistakes, your future anxieties, your identity as a smoker, for example.
The narrative self is so often the source of shame and anxiety and all those repetitive negative loops we get stuck in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the ego also includes the multisensory or embodied self-concept. That's your sense of body ownership, knowing where you are in space, the physical boundary between you and the outside world.
Okay.
Ego dissolution is the temporary radical loss of that subjective self-identity across both of those domains.
And the quotes from people who've gone through it they're genuinely startling.
The reports really illustrate the process. A participant might say something like, I started to feel confused about who I was and where I was. I felt like I was disintegrating, and then after that, complete bliss.
So the disintegration of the self is scary, but it's often followed by that positive mood factor, the ecstasy and the peace.
That makes perfect sense. If the self that is dissolving is the self that's burdened by addiction or anxiety or trauma, then the loss of that entire framework is actually experienced as a kind of profound relief.
Yeah.
Another description really captures the physical side of it. Felt my body melting. A slow, fuzzy feeling of dissolving into nothingness. And then there's the ultimate experience of self-loss, which feeds directly into that feeling of unity. I was lost, all distinctions were lost, there was nothing, no time, no memory, nothing distinct, just total absorption.
That absorption, that loss of the bounded self, that seems to be the essential first step. You have to lose yourself to find that connection to everything else.
When the personal self dissolves, what rushes in to take its place is that feeling of profound, universal interconnectedness. You hear things like the sense of unity and love like I've never experienced before, or felt at one with the universe.
And that's the therapeutic window.
That dissolution is so strongly correlated with therapeutic efficacy because it creates the space for complete psychological reset.
And that psychological reset is what researchers are now calling the pivotal mental state, or PiMS. This feels like a critical framework for understanding how a drug can actually facilitate such deep, lasting change.
PiMS is defined as a transient, intense, hyperplastic state of mind and brain that allows for rapid and deep learning.
Hyperplastic.
Yeah.
So more changeable.
Way more. Think of your brain not as a fully formed, solid structure, but as wet cement. Ordinarily, your brain is pretty dry and fixed in its patterns, like the deep ruts in a road from driving the same way over and over again.
That's addiction right there, the rutted road.
Exactly. PiMS is like briefly melting the asphalt so that when you drive over it again, you can forge an entirely new path. The brain's usual pathways, the habits, the negative self-talk, the addictive triggers, are temporarily wiped clean.
And there's a specific biological reason for this.
There is. This hyperplasticity has a specific molecular gateway, the 5-HT2A receptor system, which is the primary target of psilocybin. Activating this system seems to be what unlocks this incredible potential for rapid reorganization.
But the theory goes deeper, right? It suggests that these brain mechanisms that psychedelics kind of hijack, they actually evolve to serve a really important innate function.
That's the evolutionary theory. The idea is that PiMS evolved to help us make major perspective shifts when circumstances demand it, particularly under conditions of chronic stress or existential crisis, or when a previous way of life is just fundamentally failing. It's thought to act as an evolutionary last gasp, a desperate, intense attempt to resolve an intolerable, persistent, stuck situation.
Like chronic depression or a debilitating addiction.
Exactly. So if your system is stuck in a self-destructive loop, The PiMS forces a change. It's almost like a psychological and neurological fork in the road.
That connects to something called bifurcation theory, right?
It does, from dynamical systems. Stress and crisis act as primers that destabilize your existing fixed psychological state. The PiMS is that moment of bifurcation, forcing a rapid change that can pivot either toward wellness, a spiritual breakthrough, or if it's managed poorly or there's no support, it can pivot toward pathology, like severe anxiety or even psychosis.
So the crucial takeaway then is that the outcome is incredibly context-dependent. In a therapeutic setting where the patient is prepared and supported, you can guide the system toward that benevolent outcome.
And we can actually contrast this powerful positive change with trauma. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is caused by a single, discrete, terrible event that causes lasting, deep negative behavioral change. It overwhelms the brain.
I sometimes struggle with that comparison. PTSD is often caused by a random, overwhelming loss of control. Are we really saying that a highly controlled, guided therapeutic session can produce the same magnitude of change?
That's a brilliant point, and it's why researchers often call it an inverse PTSD-like effect. It's not identical in structure, but it operates on a similar principle of magnitude. The CME is a single, salient, intense event that fundamentally re-encodes your narrative self and produces enduring beneficial changes. Instead of cementing fear and helplessness, it cements unity and meaning.
Okay, so does this temporary identity reset, this hyperplasticity, does it lead to measurable changes in how a person actually interacts with the world long term?
Absolutely. We see it so clearly in the data on enduring personality traits. Most people know that your core personality traits are considered really stable after age 30.
Right. Your level of neuroticism or agreeableness, it doesn't really shift much in adulthood.
But after a high-dose psilocybin session, researchers have consistently found that participants who had a complete mystical experience showed a significant increase in the personality domain of openness.
And openness is?
It's a broad trait. It covers things like intellectual curiosity, appreciation for aesthetics and art, imagination, creativity.
And this wasn't just a temporary high.
Not at all. That increase in openness remained significantly higher than their baseline more than 1 year after the session. This is incredibly powerful evidence that these mystical-type experiences can facilitate real adult personality change.
That shift is massive. It means they're fundamentally changing how they approach the world. They become more willing to consider new perspectives, new values, new ways of living.
Which is absolutely essential if you're trying to escape an entrenched behavior like addiction.
And this change in identity, it also seems to lead to these profound shifts in pro-sociality and values. I saw this term, the shift from egoism to ecoism.
Yes. By transcending the bounded self and experiencing that ultimate unity, people feel less separate from the natural world, from their community.
It's the visceral realization that all is one, which then fosters this deep sense of ecological and communal responsibility.
The research backs this up. The experience mediates measurable increases in nature relatedness. Their whole valuation system changes because the center of valuation, the isolated self-interested ego, temporarily ceases to exist. They realize the boundary between self and other is an illusion, and that changes all their priorities.
This psychological model is so powerful, but now we have to get to the ultimate data point. All the models are just theories until they meet the cold, hard reality of human behavior. And the most compelling argument for the MEQ30's relevance is its ability to predict success in the most resistant human behaviors. We're talking about stopping addiction.
This is really where the MEQ30 goes from being a philosophical instrument to being a powerful clinical tool. Nicotine addiction is notoriously difficult to treat. You have drugs like varenicline, nicotine patches combined with behavioral therapy, and even with all that, most established programs report abstinence rates of less than 35%, and long-term success is even lower than that.
Okay, so let's detail that crucial Johns Hopkins study on smoking cessation, because the results were just completely outside the norm.
This was an open-label pilot study with 15 psychiatrically healthy nicotine-dependent smokers. And critically, these were not casual smokers. These were heavy smokers.
Right.
They had averaged 6 previous quit attempts in their lifetimes and had been smoking for an average of 31 years. These were treatment-resistant people.
And what was the protocol?
They received 2 or 3 high doses of psilocybin, integrated within a structured 15-week smoking cessation program that also included cognitive behavioral therapy and guided imagery.
And the success rates? They just blew standard treatments out of the water.
The results were truly unprecedented. The study achieved a biologically verified smoking abstinence rate of 80% at 6 months after the treatment.
80%.
80%.
Yeah.
And this was verified with biomarkers like cotinine levels, so we know it wasn't just people saying they quit.
And did it last?
It did. The success rate remained incredibly robust at the 12-month follow-up, with 67% abstinence reported long-term.
That is the very definition of quantum change. This data completely challenges the established biomedical model, which pretty much insists that healing has to happen gradually in small incremental steps.
Right, through willpower over a long time.
Instead, a single, discrete, intense experience resulted in this massive, lasting, beneficial change in behavior. It's a radical perspective shift, not a gradual accumulation of willpower.
The single event just rewires the whole system.
Okay, so this brings us right back to the MEQ30. If the drug is the catalyst, the big question for the researchers had to be, what part of the drug experience is actually doing the healing? Is it the visuals, the feeling of being intoxicated, or is it the subjective mystical content that's the real medicine?
And the MEQ30 proves its worth right here. The data clearly show that the people who successfully quit scored significantly higher on the MEQ30.
Okay, let's talk about the statistical proof. How strong was that link?
It was strong and it was specific. The change in their cotinine levels, that smoking biomarker, was significantly correlated with their mean MEQ30 scores. It showed an inverse relationship.
Meaning the higher the score.
The lower the biomarker. The more they smoked before, the more that biomarker dropped if they had a high mystical score.
Yeah.
It's a direct dose-response relationship between the depth of the spiritual feeling and a physical health outcome.
Now, for the critical comparison, what about just the sheer overwhelming intensity of the trip?
This is the crucial finding. The general intensity of the drug effects, which they measure with different scales, like the hallucinogen rating scale that tracks visual intensity, auditory distortion, just how high you feel.
Yeah.
That was not significantly associated with whether or not they quit smoking. It was basically a statistical non-factor.
That is the ultimate proof of the MEQ30's validity. It wasn't how strong the drug was that mattered. It was the specific mystical type quality of the experience as defined by those 4 factors that determine success.
The experience is not just a side effect of the medicine. The experience is the medicine, provided it hits that mystical threshold.
The addiction, which was this central organizing principle of their daily life, it suddenly seems small and irrelevant against the backdrop of cosmic unity.
Exactly. The experience provides this existential, emotional, and cognitive reorganization that just completely reframes their priorities.
And this shift is deeply rooted. It's not just a temporary behavioral fix. It feels like an existential reset.
The long-term follow-up data confirms that. Participants overwhelmingly attributed huge degrees of meaning and spiritual significance to the psilocybin session.
How much?
Even 14 months later, somewhere between 58 and 67% of the volunteers rated that psilocybin session as one of the top 5 most personally meaningful or spiritually significant experiences of their entire lives.
Top 5 of their entire lives.
On par with the birth of a child or the death of a parent.
That level of attribution, it just suggests as a foundational change in their worldview. And that's what makes the behavioral change stick. If you quit smoking because a spiritual breakthrough showed you the true value of life.
That's a much stronger motivation than just trying to manage cravings with a nicotine patch.
For sure.
And this lines up beautifully with all the broader findings in addiction recovery. We've known for a long time that increased levels of spirituality are associated with significantly improved long-term outcomes in substance dependence recovery. The MEQ30 just gives us the tool to quantify the magnitude of the spiritual event that kickstarts that whole process.
The MEQ30 is clearly a powerful predictive tool, maybe one of the strongest we have in modern behavioral health. So if we can measure the experience and correlate it so strongly to success, does that mean researchers should just focus on maximizing that mystical score no matter what?
That raises a really critical question about clinical practice. If we focus too narrowly on just pumping up the MEQ30 score, we risk ignoring all the essential factors that turn a potentially overwhelming experience into a therapeutic one.
Right.
We have to remember that psychedelic effects are profoundly experience-dependent. They're shaped not just by the drug, but by the context.
We're talking about set and setting.
Exactly. Intention, preparation, the environment, the support you have. That smoking cessation study didn't just give people psilocybin in a sterile room. It was administered within a structured 15-week program that included CBT and guided imagery. The drug is the catalyst, But the structured environment is the guide that determines the direction of that hyperplastic state.
And we can't overstate the importance of the work that's done after the peak experience.
Integration.
Integration.
It is the necessary mediating factor for beneficial change. It happens in the days and weeks after the session. Your brain is in that PiMS state, that wet cement phase, where it's highly susceptible to new learning.
So the integration work, the therapy sessions, the journaling, the conscious effort to apply the insights you gain during the CME, that's what leverages that plasticity to lock in the new behaviors and reorganize the mind away from addiction.
Without integration, the breakthrough might just fade away like a dream. If the CME is the moment of radical realization, integration is the hard work of turning that realization into enduring action. It's the consolidation phase.
So the MEQ30 is powerful, but it's important to recognize its limitations too. It's intentionally a positively valenced measure.
What do you mean by that?
It focuses on unity, joy, sacredness. It doesn't really have a way to capture the negative or challenging aspects of an experience, which are often a huge part of the therapeutic process.
That's precisely why the field is expanding its measurement tools. Researchers know they need to capture the full phenomenological range, including the struggle. For instance, we now have the Challenging Experience Questionnaire, or CEQ.
And that measures things like...
It measures the negative stuff: grief, fear, isolation, anxiety, paranoia.
But if the goal is to maximize the mystical experience, why would we bother measuring fear and grief?
Because sometimes the breakthrough only comes after the struggle. The process of confronting repressed trauma or deep-seated anxiety can be profoundly difficult during the session, but that cathartic release might be exactly what's necessary for the long-term benefit. The CEQ helps us understand that a difficult experience isn't always a bad outcome.
We also have other instruments now, right? Like the Emotional Breakthrough Inventory, the eBay.
Right, which measures beneficial, effective experiences, recognizing the cathartic power of emotional release.
Yeah.
And the Ego Dissolution Inventory, or EDI, which specifically hones in on that loss of self-boundaries and confirms its correlation with connection and unity.
So the goal of future research isn't to replace the MEQ30, it's to complement it.
Exactly. We need a full suite of tools to capture everything: the subjective struggle, the emotional catharsis, the cognitive insight, and ultimately the mystical state itself. That holistic approach ensures we understand the full, often messy process of transformation, not just the beautiful peak.
Okay, let's bring this deep dive to a close. We started with the sheer paradox of trying to measure the transcendent, the spiritual, with a 30-item checklist, the MEQ30.
We established its rigorous scientific foundation, tracing back to Stace's work, and we defined those 4 key factors: mysticality, positive mood, transcendence of time and space, and ineffability. And we saw that the critical benchmark is the complete mystical experience scoring 60% across all 4, which acts as this robust predictor of enduring change.
We then connected that measurement to the core mechanism of change, ego dissolution, that temporary destabilization of identity that induces the pivotal mental state, that transient phase of hyperplasticity in the brain.
A state that enables rapid deep learning, which we see manifest as enduring increases in the core personality trait of openness.
And most powerfully, we looked at that startling data from the smoking cessation trials. The MEQ30 proved its clinical relevance by showing that it's the mystical quality of the experience, not just the drug's general intensity, that predicts quantum change success. It leads to success rates that just demolish the standard treatments for one of the hardest addictions to break.
It really underscores the power of a deep, subjective perspective shift in tackling our most entrenched behaviors.
So the conventional wisdom in modern therapy is that healing happens gradually in small incremental steps. It requires this immense personal struggle over months or even years. But the data on the MEQ30 and these quantum change experiences, it demonstrates that a single, intense, subjectively defined spiritual experience can reliably produce benevolent and enduring transformation. So this raises a profound question for you to consider. If the measurement of an inner subjective spiritual state is the strongest predictor of a major outer behavioral outcome like quitting a lifelong addiction, how much of lasting human healing relies not on those incremental steps, but on radical, instantaneous shifts in perspective?
It really forces us to reconsider the whole hierarchy of healing. Maybe the focus shouldn't just be on managing symptoms, but on fundamentally resetting the narrative and the perspective of the self.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Wonder Fungi.